At 2:14 p.m. on a freezing Thursday in Chicago, my phone buzzed with a message that shattered 8 years of marriage. I was standing at a cherrywood podium presenting a corporate seminar on shell company vulnerabilities. The projector screen illuminated the faces of 300 banking executives. I glanced down at the glowing screen of my device. The sender was Victoria Davis, 28 years old, junior acquisitions director at the commercial real estate firm my husband Julian owned. The message read, "He is leaving you for me. He told me everything." My pulse stayed at a steady 60 beats per minute. The air conditioning in the ballroom felt cool against the back of my neck. I did not grip the edges of the podium. I did not gasp or flush with humiliation. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her entire world in 60 seconds, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever built an empire from the ground up only to have someone else try to claim the throne? Let me know your age in the comments below. And welcome to Salt Vengeance. I looked back up at the audience and finished my closing remarks with a practiced smile. The applause washed over me like a dull roar. I walked down the carpeted steps, declining eager offers for coffee from delegates, and stepped into a quiet marble hallway. Only then did I unlock my secure cloud server. I am a 46-year-old senior forensic wealth auditor. I spend my days tracking stolen assets across international borders and uncovering the lies people tell with numbers. Victoria thought she was stealing a charismatic, wealthy husband. I knew she was inheriting a federal indictment. Julian was the charming face of our joint wealth. He bought bespoke suits and remembered the first name of every waiter in the city. But I was the architect of our finances. I opened a restricted file on my phone labeled Vela Holdings. Inside sat a sealed Internal Revenue Service criminal investigation notice. The document detailed an intricate embezzlement scheme involving over $4 million in stolen corporate funds. Sitting right there on the second page was the legally registered address for the fraudulent shell company. It was Victoria's luxury penthouse apartment. I cropped the image so the federal seal and her home address were front and center on the screen. I hit reply. I attached the photo. I typed nothing else. I stood in the quiet hallway and watched my screen. 3 gray dots appeared at the bottom of the thread. Victoria was typing. The dots danced for 3 agonizing seconds. Then they vanished. She never texted me again. The realization must have hit her like ice water. She was not Julian's romantic escape. She was his designated fall guy. 10 minutes later, a new message popped up on my screen. It was Julian. "Hey, weird bank glitch today. The Platinum card just declined at lunch. Can you check the joint account when you have a second?" I slipped my phone into my pocket. The smell of expensive catered coffee drifted from the ballroom doors. I smiled at the empty hallway. The marriage was over. The audit had officially begun. I did not hail a cab to return to our sprawling estate in the northern suburbs. Confrontation is a chaotic tactic, reserved for amateurs who let their emotions dictate their survival. Instead, I walked 3 blocks through the biting Chicago wind to my private office on LaSalle Street. The biometric scanner at the entrance glowed a faint green, reading my fingerprint, before the heavy glass door clicked shut. It sealed me inside a hushed sanctuary filled with humming servers. The air smelled faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. This was my domain. Julian and I built our wealth management firm from the ground up. He was 48 years old with a smile that could disarm a hesitant board of directors and a golf handicap that secured multi-million-dollar startup investments. He was the charismatic face of our empire. He wore the bespoke Italian suits and remembered the first names of every executive we courted. I was the architect. I designed the predictive algorithms. I structured the complex portfolios. I built the impenetrable digital walls around our money. Or so I had chosen to believe. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair and woke the dual monitors on my desk. My fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with practiced clinical precision. I bypassed the standard joint checking accounts and our visible investment portfolios. Those were obvious. Those were decoys. I dug straight into the hidden bedrock of our financial existence. I opened the encrypted ledgers for our twin daughters' educational trust funds, the screen populated with rows of clinical black text and green numbers. I scrolled down the master ledger. A sudden, sharp drop in the balance graph caught my eye. My stomach tightened into a knot. It was not a minor market fluctuation. It was a systematic, deliberate hemorrhage. For the past 14 months, regular monthly wire transfers had been silently draining the trusts. Julian was smart enough not to attempt a direct hack into the system. A brute force entry or a changed password would have triggered 7 different security alerts on my phone within seconds. He used a far more elegant weapon. He weaponized my own trust. I pulled up the recipient routing numbers, highlighting the destination of the stolen capital. The funds were flowing outward into a corporate account registered to a vendor named Apex Property Management. The name echoed in my memory. I accessed the firm archives and located the original vendor authorization file. My own digital signature sat at the bottom of the page, dated 3 years ago. Julian had casually asked me to approve Apex for routine landscaping and snow removal across our commercial properties. It was a minor piece of administrative paperwork slipped onto my desk during a busy quarter. I had signed it without a second thought, trusting my husband to handle the operational logistics. He repurposed that approved vendor identification to bypass the trust fund firewalls. Because I had authorized the entity, the system flagged the massive outbound transfers as legitimate business expenses. He funneled out the money, drop by drop, over a year and a half. $4 million vanished into the ether. The stakes shifted in the blink of an eye. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated my tongue. This was no longer about a bruised ego or a cliché midlife crisis affair. Julian was not just sleeping with a junior executive. He was a highly calculating financial predator. He was methodically stealing generational wealth from his own children to fund his offshore secrets and his new life. The drive back to the suburbs took 45 minutes. I used every single second of that commute to bury my shock beneath a thick layer of impenetrable ice. When I pulled my SUV into our heated garage, my breathing was slow and perfectly measured. I walked through the mudroom, adjusting my posture to project tired contentment. I pushed open the door to the sprawling kitchen. Julian stood at the white marble island pouring gin into a crystal tumbler. The ice clinked softly against the glass. He wore a tailored navy suit jacket with the collar unbuttoned, looking relaxed and undeniably handsome. He smiled when he saw me walk into the room. It was the same bright, easy smile that had convinced me to marry him 8 years ago. The exact same smile he used to charm investors out of their capital. "You are home late," he said, sliding a fresh cocktail across the counter toward me. He leaned in and pressed a warm kiss to my cheek. He smelled of bergamot and expensive vermouth. I had the most frustrating afternoon. My corporate platinum card bounced at the steakhouse downtown. Some ridiculous banking error. "Can you take a look at the joint accounts tomorrow morning when you log in?" I picked up the heavy crystal glass. The condensation chilled my fingertips, grounding me in the present moment. I took a slow sip of the gin, letting the botanical burn settle in my chest. "Of course," I said, keeping my voice light and entirely unbothered. "I will call the bank in the morning. It is probably just a routine fraud trigger from a weird merchant code." Julian nodded, taking a long drink from his own glass. He reached up to adjust his collar, stretching his arm out. My eyes tracked the movement. My gaze locked onto his left wrist. The skin below his crisp white cuff was bare. When Julian and I got married, my father gave him a wedding gift. It was an antique silver Rolex Daytona, a priceless family heirloom that my father had worn every single day of his life until he passed away from a sudden heart attack. It represented honor and continuity. We kept it locked in the biometric safe in our master bedroom. Julian only wore it on very special occasions. He had been wearing it this morning when he kissed me goodbye and left for the office. "You are not wearing my father's watch," I noted. My tone was conversational, mildly curious. I kept my face blank, betraying nothing. Julian barely missed a beat. He set his glass down on the marble counter. "Oh, "Right," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "The clasp was getting a little loose. I noticed it slipping during a meeting. I dropped it off at the jeweler on Oak Street for a quick cleaning and repair before coming home. I will pick it up next week." He lied with flawless, chilling execution. His heart rate did not visibly spike. His eyes did not dart away to look at the floor. If I had not seen that text message from his mistress, I would have believed him instantly. But I knew the truth. Victoria had a known penchant for vintage watches. I had seen her wearing a silver men's watch in a few recent social media posts. I had assumed it was a trendy, oversized purchase funded by her recent promotion. Now the dark reality settled over me. Julian had taken my family legacy out of our private vault and wrapped it around his mistress's wrist. He stood there drinking his gin, expecting me to smile back at him. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the stolen money was secure, and his secret life was perfectly insulated. I realized in the quiet hum of that kitchen that any emotional reaction would be a fatal error. Tears or screams would only signal him to hide the remaining assets and call his defense lawyers. I had to remain the oblivious, devoted wife until my trap was primed to snap shut. I smiled at the man who was actively destroying my family. I told him dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. I watched him walk into the living room entirely unaware that his arrogance had just handed me the very weapon I would use to dismantle his life. To catch a predator, you must first convince him that he is the one hunting. I needed time to set the stage for my false surrender. The next evening, I arrived home 2 hours early. I logged into our secondary household checking account and downloaded the most recent digital statement. I imported the file into a financial design software. I isolated a legitimate line item for a mundane corporate retreat expense. With surgical precision, I altered the merchant identification code and the vendor name. I transformed the line into a $5,000 charge at a notorious luxury resort in Miami. I matched the pixel density, the font weight, and the specific kerning of our banking institution. I printed the altered document on heavy bond paper to give it tactile authenticity. I left it sitting squarely on the mahogany dining table, right beside his favorite leather coaster. Next came the physical performance. I walked into the master bathroom and stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror. I needed to look like a woman whose entire universe had just collapsed under the weight of a broken heart. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, rubbing them until the sclera turned a raw, bloodshot crimson. I applied a thin, uneven layer of mascara. I splashed my face with cold water, letting the dark pigment run in faint, jagged streaks down my cheeks. I unbuttoned the top of my silk blouse and let my shoulders slump forward. The brilliant, untouchable forensic auditor vanished into the ether. In her place stood a fragile, terrified, and heartbroken wife. Julian walked through the front door promptly at 7 o'clock. I heard the familiar jingle of his keys dropping into the ceramic bowl in the foyer. He called my name, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I did not answer. I sat in the unlit living room, wrapped in a cashmere throw blanket, clutching the fabricated bank statement. He found me sitting in the shadows. The performance commenced. I looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I let my lower lip tremble. I held up the paper and asked him to explain the Miami charge in a choked whisper. I asked him who he took to the resort. Julian froze in the doorway. For a fraction of a second, genuine terror flashed across his handsome features. His mind raced frantically. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes as he calculated the damage. He thought I had stumbled onto the edge of his offshore accounts or discovered the drained trust funds. Then he stepped closer and looked down at the specific paper in my shaking hand. He saw the $5,000 Miami charge. The wave of relief that washed over him was a tangible force in the room. The tension drained from his shoulders. His arrogant, easy smile returned, hidden quickly behind a mask of feigned contrition. He spun a ridiculous, highly detailed story about a boys' weekend that got out of hand. He claimed he covered the bill for a college fraternity brother who was going through a tough divorce. He swore he hid the expense because he knew I despised his old drinking buddies. He lied with the smooth cadence of a seasoned sociopath. I let out a loud sob. I told him I did not believe a single word. I accused him of having a cheap hotel affair. I buried my face in my hands, weeping loudly, and demanded he give me space. I told him I could not bear to sleep in the same house as a liar. Julian played the part of the chastised, guilty husband to perfection. He apologized repeatedly, but I saw the triumphant predatory gleam in his dark eyes. He eagerly packed an overnight leather duffel bag, offering to stay at a downtown hotel to let me cool off. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He thought he had won. He believed my emotional grief had blinded me to the millions missing from the trusts. By leaning directly into his misogynistic assumption that a weeping woman could never pose a strategic threat, I secured the darkness I needed to operate. The following morning, I drove my SUV to a rundown concrete strip mall on the industrial outskirts of the city. I intentionally bypassed the sleek glass high-rises where the elite corporate litigators operated. I walked into the cramped, poorly lit office of a man named Gary Higgins. Gary was a notoriously mediocre family law attorney who advertised his low rates on highway billboards. His waiting room smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. He wore a rumpled gray suit and spoke in bored, monotone sentences, promising quick, cheap settlements. I hired Gary on the spot and handed him a retainer fee in cash. I instructed him to draft a standard preliminary separation agreement immediately. I wanted Julian to receive a letter bearing the letterhead of a bargain bin lawyer. When Julian handed that pathetic document to his high-powered legal team, they would laugh out loud. They would advise him that I was unrepresented, weak, and highly vulnerable. It was the perfect decoy. By making myself look helpless, I lulled my enemy into a state of deep, dangerous complacency. While Julian spent his evenings at his luxury hotel, undoubtedly sharing expensive room service with Victoria, I returned to my private office on the South Street. I locked the biometric door and fired up my dual monitors. I was not crying. I was hunting. My firm had recently acquired exclusive beta access to a new artificial intelligence tool designed in tandem with the Internal Revenue Service. It was a predictive algorithmic engine capable of tracing phantom funds through thousands of shell companies in a matter of seconds. I sat in the cool blue glow of the screens and fed every single piece of Julian's financial data into the federal grid. I uploaded the Apex Property Management routing numbers. I submitted the forged vendor authorizations bearing my signature. I inputted the exact dates and timestamps of the trust fund transfers. The algorithm digested the raw information silently. It cross-referenced Julian's corporate tax identification against global banking registries. I watched the screen as the software mapped the exact route of the stolen capital. It painted a digital highway leading straight from my daughter's accounts into the offshore holding firm registered to Victoria Davis. I did not just locate the stolen money. I compiled an airtight prosecutorial dossier. I categorized the wire fraud, the tax evasion, and the identity theft into neat, encrypted folders. The federal database now possessed a dormant alert carrying Julian's exact financial fingerprint. The trap was armed and waiting in the shadows. All I needed was a trigger to detonate the entire structure. I closed the program as my phone chimed with an incoming calendar notification. It was a reminder for a lavish family dinner party Julian had insisted on hosting this coming weekend to maintain our high society facade. The guest list included his affluent relatives and business partners. One specific name on that digital list caught my attention and made my blood run cold. It was a woman I had always trusted, a sharp corporate strategy consultant who understood how to hide liquid assets better than anyone in Chicago. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian was simply not smart enough to build that complex offshore architecture alone. Someone in his own bloodline had drawn the blueprint for him. The dining room table stretched 14 feet long, carved from a single slab of polished walnut. Crystal wine glasses caught the ambient light of the chandelier, casting fractured prisms across the white linen tablecloth. Julian sat at the head of the table, holding court. He wore a tailored charcoal blazer, pouring an expensive Pinot Noir for his wealthy colleagues and extended family. He played the role of the devoted, affluent patriarch with terrifying ease. He thought his secret was safe. He believed my fabricated tears from 3 nights ago meant I was broken, blind, and compliant. I sat at the opposite end of the table, cutting my roasted duck into precise mathematical squares. I wore a high-necked cream silk dress, speaking only when spoken to, projecting the exact image of a submissive, tired wife. To my immediate right sat Aunt Valerie. She was Julian's paternal aunt, an African-American woman who possessed a razor-sharp intellect and a commanding physical presence. She wore a tailored emerald pantsuit that signaled her high status. Valerie had spent 3 decades shattering corporate glass ceilings in the cutthroat strategy sector of downtown Chicago. She was a senior consultant who specialized in wealth insulation for high-net-worth clients. For years, I had looked up to her. I admired her relentless drive and her refusal to suffer fools. Whenever Julian and I faced a complex tax restructuring hurdle, Valerie was the first person we called. I trusted her implicitly. That trust was about to become the most dangerous weapon in the room. The conversation drifted from golf handicaps to the changing landscape of commercial real estate. Valerie swirled her wine, holding the thin stem of the glass between her manicured fingers. She leaned forward and made a passing comment about mitigating capital gains through tiered vendor holding companies. She specifically referenced a highly obscure loophole regarding offshore property management entities. It was a dense, technical term that 99% of the population would never understand. But I understood it. The phrase triggered a silent alarm in my mind. It was the exact financial structure used by Apex Property Management, the dummy corporation Julian used to drain my daughter's trust funds. I set my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. "Excuse me for a moment," I murmured to the table, offering a tight, polite smile. "I need to check on the dessert course." I walked through the swinging doors into the cavernous kitchen, leaving the laughter and the clinking crystal behind. The private catering staff had already departed, leaving the space immaculate and quiet. I opened the hidden false bottom drawer near the walk-in pantry and withdrew my encrypted tablet. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh, pale light. I bypassed the security firewalls and dove straight into the digital notary logs attached to the fraudulent Apex authorizations. I isolated the metadata embedded in the original vendor approval document. I traced the Internet Protocol address of the digital notary stamp. The numerical sequence did not route back to a standard legal firm. It pinged directly to a private, secure server located on Wacker Drive, the exact floor and suite number of Aunt Valerie's boutique consulting agency. The cold reality settled deep into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. Julian was charming, but he lacked the forensic genius required to build an impenetrable offshore tax shelter. He needed an architect. Valerie provided the blueprint. She knew Julian was stealing from her own great nieces. She actively advised him on how to bypass my personal security protocols to fund his secret life with Victoria. The betrayal was no longer confined to a cheating husband. The rot had bled deep into the family bloodline. A lesser woman would have marched back into the dining room screaming accusations and throwing wine. I did not operate in the realm of hysterics. I operated in the realm of legal liability. I tapped the screen of my tablet, opening a blank legal template. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, drafting a highly specific indemnification clause. I titled the document as a routine consulting waiver for our upcoming annual portfolio review. It looked like standard bureaucratic paperwork. But buried in the 4th paragraph, beneath layers of dense, impenetrable legal jargon, was a lethal trap. By signing the document, the signatory legally claimed full fiduciary responsibility for all entities tied to the Vela Holdings offshore account. I hit print. The laser printer in Julian's home office whirred to life, spitting out 2 crisp sheets of paper. I retrieved the documents and slipped them into a sleek leather portfolio. I walked to the climate-controlled wine cellar and selected a bottle of 1982 vintage Bordeaux. It was a rare, robust wine that cost more than most people's mortgages. It was also Valerie's ultimate favorite. I uncorked the bottle, letting the rich, earthy aroma fill the air. I carried the wine and the portfolio back into the dining room. I approached Valerie's chair, pouring a generous measure of the dark red liquid into her empty glass. She looked up, her eyes gleaming with sophisticated approval. "You always did have impeccable taste, Bella," she purred, taking a slow, appreciative sip. I offered a humble, self-deprecating smile. "I try my best," I replied, keeping my voice soft and slightly breathless. "Actually, Valerie, since you are here, I was hoping to ask a small favor. I am feeling a bit overwhelmed with the upcoming quarterly portfolio review. Julian has been so busy, and my mind has been elsewhere lately." I placed the leather portfolio on the table, sliding it gently toward her plate. I continued playing the role of the exhausted, overwhelmed housewife. "I need an external consultant to sign off on the standard liability waivers before the accountants arrive on Monday. It is just routine compliance, but I would feel so much better knowing your expert eyes were on the architecture." Valerie soaked up the flattery like dry earth absorbing rain. Her ego was a living, breathing entity in the room. She loved feeling superior. She loved being the smartest person at the table. She pulled a gold fountain pen from her tailored jacket pocket. She did not bother to read the fine print. She assumed I was too distracted by my failing marriage to draft anything dangerous. She flipped to the second page and signed her elegant looping signature directly on the dotted line. The ink dried, soaking into the fibers of the thick paper. I slid the portfolio back, pulling it away from her manicured hands. "Thank you, Valerie," I whispered. "You have no idea how much this helps me." She smiled, taking another long sip of the expensive Bordeaux. She thought she was placating a weak, desperate woman. She had no idea she had just legally chained herself to a sinking ship. She was now the primary financial guarantor of a $4 million fraudulent debt. When the federal indictment landed, it would obliterate her consulting firm, her pristine reputation, and her freedom. The dinner party wound down 2 hours later. Guests exchanged air kisses and climbed into waiting town cars. The house fell silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. Julian unbuttoned his collar and loosened his silk tie. He poured himself a final glass of scotch, looking incredibly pleased with his performance as the perfect host. He walked over to where I stood, wiping down the pristine granite counters. He wrapped an arm around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You were wonderful tonight," he murmured, his breath warm and laced with alcohol. "I know things have been tense, but I really appreciate you putting on a brave face for the family." I kept my hands moving in slow, deliberate circles with the damp cloth. "It was my pleasure," I replied. Julian took a sip of his scotch. By the way he added, his tone shifting to casual business, "I have a minor plumbing disaster at one of the commercial properties. I need to wire $50,000 to a contractor first thing tomorrow morning. Can you authorize that transfer when you log into the system?" The request hung in the quiet air of the kitchen. It was his final, desperate move to liquidate cash before he packed his bags. I did not flinch. I turned and looked directly into his lying eyes, offering a bright, compliant smile. "Of course, Julian," I said. "I will take care of it first thing in the morning." The morning sun filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of my private study, casting long, sharp shadows across the Persian rug. The air in the room felt thick and still. I sat behind my antique oak desk, staring at the neat stack of documents resting on the leather blotter. Today was the fulcrum on which my entire revenge pivoted. I needed Julian to sign away his corporate kingdom, and I needed him to do it with a smile on his face. I opened the top drawer and withdrew a small vial of saline drops. I tilted my head back and squeezed the liquid into my eyes, blinking rapidly until the salt stung my tear ducts. I rubbed the delicate skin beneath my lower lashes until it turned a bruised, mottled pink. I wore an oversized gray cashmere sweater that swallowed my frame, making my shoulders look narrow and defeated. I swept my hair into a messy, loose knot. I looked exactly like a woman who had spent the entire night crying on the bathroom floor. I picked up the thick manila folder containing the preliminary separation agreement. It bore the embarrassing clip art logo of Gary Higgins, the discount family law attorney I had hired 2 days prior. The paper was thin and cheap. The formatting was slightly misaligned. To an arrogant man like Julian, a man who employed partners at elite downtown legal firms, this document would look like an absolute joke. He would see the bargain bin letterhead and assume the contents were equally worthless. He would never suspect that a senior forensic auditor had personally drafted the final 3 pages. The initial pages of the agreement contained standard boilerplate language regarding temporary asset division and physical boundaries. It requested mutual non-interference and proposed an amicable, mediated timeline. But buried deep within the addendums, hidden under dense paragraphs of indemnification waivers and temporary fiduciary holds, sat the lethal mechanism. It was a Chekhov's gun, loaded and aimed directly at his financial jugular. The clause stipulated that in the event of any active formal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Internal Revenue Service, Julian would immediately surrender his proxy voting rights for the board of directors at his commercial real estate firm. The wording transferred those proxy rights entirely to me to ensure the unencumbered continuation of family financial stability. It sounded like an overzealous cheap lawyer trying to protect a fragile wife from potential future audits. In reality, it was the key to a hostile corporate takeover. Julian held the majority shares in his firm. Without his proxy vote, he was a king without a sword. I checked my watch. 8:15 in the morning. Julian was running late for a strategy meeting downtown. I knew he was anxious to leave the house. I knew he was planning to meet Victoria for a quick espresso before heading into the office. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and asked him to step into the study before he left. The heavy oak door swung open a minute later. Julian stood in the threshold, radiating nervous energy. He wore a sharp, slate-gray suit, holding his leather briefcase in one hand and checking his phone with the other. His eyes darted toward me, and he quickly pocketed the device. He took a step into the room, his posture rigid and defensive. He expected another tearful interrogation about the fabricated Miami charge. He braced himself for a screaming match that would delay his rendezvous with his young mistress. I did not raise my voice. I looked up at him through red-rimmed eyes and let out a long, trembling exhale. "Julian," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly on the second syllable. "I cannot do this anymore. I am too tired to fight with you." The defensive posture melted off his frame in an instant. He walked slowly toward the desk, his polished Oxford shoes silent on the rug. He looked down at the manila folder resting under my hands. "What is this, Bella?" he asked, adopting a tone of gentle, patronizing concern. "It is a preliminary separation agreement," I said, pushing the folder across the smooth oak surface. "I hired a lawyer. Nothing permanent yet. Just a framework so we can figure things out without tearing each other apart. I just want a clean break, Julian. I want peace. I cannot keep waking up wondering what else you are hiding from me." Julian picked up the folder. His eyes immediately caught the cheap logo of Gary Higgins printed at the top of the page. A faint, patronizing smirk twitched at the corner of his mouth before he quickly suppressed it. He recognized the name from the tacky highway billboards. He realized his brilliant, calculating wife had been reduced to hiring a strip mall attorney out of sheer emotional desperation. His hubris inflated, filling the quiet study. He flipped through the first few pages, skimming the text with practiced speed. He read the clauses about maintaining separate residences and the standard non-disparagement agreements. His eyes glazed over the dense legal formatting. He checked his watch again. He was calculating the minutes he had left to reach Victoria. He did not flip to the back pages where the proxy waiver lay waiting in the dense black ink. He saw a broken woman offering him a painless exit strategy. He saw a golden ticket to his new life. "Do I need to have my legal team review this first?" he asked, feigning hesitation. He tapped his fingers against the leather briefcase, eager to close the deal. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. "You can if you want," I whispered, looking down at my lap. But Gary said it is just a temporary measure to establish boundaries until we decide on the final divorce terms. It just protects both of us while we transition. If you want to fight me through the courts, Julian, I do not have the strength to stop you. I just want you to sign it so we can move forward amicably." Julian pulled a sleek silver pen from his breast pocket. He did not want to involve his elite lawyers yet. He knew his own high-priced legal team would demand a full forensic accounting of all marital assets before advising him to sign anything. A full accounting would expose the $4 million missing from the trust funds. He needed to keep the financial waters calm and muddy until his offshore transfers were secure. He leaned over the antique desk, pressing the pen to the paper. "I will sign it, Bella," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I want this to be amicable, too. I am so sorry for putting you through this pain." I watched the dark blue ink flow from the metal nib. He signed his name on the bottom of page 7. He flipped the page and initialed the addendums. He pressed his signature right next to the proxy voting waiver. He legally, irrevocably surrendered the keys to his corporate empire. The ink dried in the cool morning air. The trap was officially sealed. Julian capped his pen and returned it to his pocket. He walked around the desk and stood beside my chair. He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. It was the kiss of Judas, disguised as a merciful goodbye. "We will get through this," he murmured, running a hand lightly over my shoulder. I kept my eyes cast downward, staring at his fresh signature. "Yes, we will," I replied softly. Julian turned and walked toward the heavy oak door, his footsteps light and victorious. He paused with his hand on the brass doorknob, turning back to look at me one last time. His mind was already miles away, planning his escape. "Hey, do not forget about that $50,000 wire transfer for the plumbing contractor," he said, his voice brisk and businesslike. "I need that capital moved before noon so they can start the repairs." I slowly looked up from the paperwork, meeting his gaze. "I will log into the system right now and process the transfer, Julian, I promised. Have a good day at work." The door clicked shut behind him. I sat in the silent study, alone with the signed proxy waiver. The tears vanished from my eyes instantly. My posture straightened, and my pulse settled back into a calm, lethal rhythm. Julian had just handed me his entire company. Now all I needed to do was detonate the federal tripwire and watch his world burn. The $50,000 transfer was the final match. I reached for my encrypted laptop, ready to strike the flint. The heavy oak door had barely settled into its frame when the brass knob turned again. Julian stepped back into the study. He patted the breast pocket of his slate gray suit with a feigned, apologetic grimace. He claimed he forgot his secondary authenticator token on the kitchen island and decided to just watch me push the plumbing wire through while he was standing there. He walked across the Persian rug and stepped directly behind my leather ergonomic chair. The heat radiating from his body pressed against my spine. The scent of his expensive vetiver cologne mixed with the metallic tang of pure adrenaline rising in my throat. This was the defining moment. He was going to watch me execute his final liquidation effort. If he noticed the specific numerical routing prefix hidden in the underlying code, he would know I was sending his stolen capital into a federal snare. My hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard. I forced my breathing into a slow, measured rhythm. I did not let my fingers tremble. I woke the encrypted laptop. The display cast a pale blue glow across my knuckles. I opened our primary wealth management portal, the interface populated with our joint checking balances and the standard corporate holding accounts. Julian leaned closer. His chin practically rested on my right shoulder. I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the luxury watch he wore on his wrist. It was not my father's antique Rolex. He had replaced it with a sleek modern chronograph to hide his theft. His dark eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen. "Read the account numbers to me," I said, keeping my voice mild and compliant. I opened a new external transfer dialog box. Julian rattled off a 12-digit sequence. It was an offshore transit route. He believed he was funneling $50,000 out of our domestic reach and slipping it into his secret Caribbean ledger. I typed the exact numbers he recited into the designated recipient field. Then I engaged a hidden keystroke macro I had coded 3 days prior. The screen displayed the offshore digits he read aloud. The visual interface looked flawless, but the underlying architecture rerouted the actual destination. The true destination was an active Internal Revenue Service honeypot account. My forensic auditing firm utilized these secure federal traps to capture suspected corporate money laundering activities during high-level investigations. Any capital entering that specific numerical sequence triggered an instantaneous algorithmic lock across the sender's entire financial network. The Treasury Department designed the system to freeze fleeing assets before a suspect could cross an international border. My cursor hovered over the bright blue authorization button. Julian tapped a rhythmic, impatient beat against the edge of my antique mahogany desk. He was agonizingly close to his perceived freedom. He thought this $50,000 would furnish his new life with Victoria while he waited for the dust to settle. "Go ahead," he urged softly, his breath warm against my neck. "Let us get this handled so the contractors can start tearing up the floors." I pressed the trackpad. A crisp green checkmark illuminated the center of the display. Transfer authorized. Julian let out a long, satisfied exhale. He patted my shoulder twice, his palm heavy and warm through my oversized cashmere sweater. "You are a lifesaver, Bella," he murmured. He turned and walked toward the exit. A cheerful tune slipped through his lips. He whistled a bright, upbeat melody as he crossed the room. The sound was sharp and arrogant. The brass handle clicked shut, sealing him outside the study for the final time. I sat perfectly still in the quiet room. I stared at the digital clock in the lower right corner of my monitor. The federal compliance system required exactly 60 seconds to process the honeypot trigger and verify the sender credentials. I counted the seconds in my head. My heartbeat synchronized with the ticking digital numbers. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50 seconds, 59, 60. My secondary monitor flashed. A stark crimson banner unfurled across the top of the banking interface. The bold white letters spelled out, "Federal Compliance Hold Initiated." I opened Julian's master portfolio overview. The comforting green positive numbers shifted to a harsh, glaring red. Heavy padlock icons materialized next to every single line item on the screen. The domestic checking accounts locked first. The joint credit lines followed a fraction of a second later. Then the algorithm traced his Social Security number and corporate tax identification through the global banking registries. His personal platinum cards deactivated. His executive expense accounts froze. His remaining equity lines of credit flatlined instantly. The cascading failure rippled through his entire financial existence. The net cast by the algorithm was merciless and thorough. It hunted down the stolen educational trust fund sitting dormant in the Apex Property Management offshore shell. Because Aunt Valerie had signed the indemnification waiver, linking that shell to Julian's primary domestic accounts, the federal system recognized the stolen money as part of the audited estate. The $4 million locked tight. Julian could not touch a single penny. Victoria could not access a dime. Valerie was legally shackled to a frozen, toxic asset. I leaned back against the firm support of my chair. I had just financially decapitated a multimillionaire in under a minute without raising my voice or leaving my desk. Julian was currently riding the elevator down to his underground parking garage. He likely planned to buy an expensive espresso with his platinum card before driving to meet his young mistress. He had no idea his empire was currently evaporating into the digital ether. He was a ghost, walking through a world he could no longer afford. The silence in the house felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a failing marriage. It was the crisp, clean quiet of a battlefield after the enemy had surrendered without realizing the war was over. The trap had snapped shut. The metal teeth were buried deep in his ankle. Now the trapped animal was going to realize it could not move. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my personal, secure mobile device. I needed a clear window into his impending destruction. Using my administrative network privileges, I logged into the cellular provider dashboard and mirrored Julian's incoming text messages. I wanted to see the exact moment the illusion shattered. I wanted to watch the panic set in. The first notification appeared on my mirrored screen 10 minutes later. It was an automated alert from his primary banking institution, informing him of a declined transaction at a local coffee shop. 3 minutes after that, a second alert flashed. His corporate autopay for the leased luxury sedan had bounced. The dominoes were falling faster than he could comprehend. I watched the text bubbles illuminate my screen, knowing his next move was entirely predictable. A man with no money and no power always runs to the nearest source of shelter. He was going to drive straight to Victoria's luxury penthouse, expecting comfort and sanctuary. He was about to find out exactly what happens when you build a relationship on stolen capital. I sat at my antique oak desk and slipped a pair of noise-canceling headphones over my ears. The leather ear cups blocked out the silence of my private study. I opened a secure application on my tablet and activated the remote audio feed. During my tearful decoy operation 3 days ago, I had required Julian to hand over his smartphone so I could verify a fabricated contact number. It took me exactly 14 seconds to embed a military-grade surveillance Trojan deep into his operating system. The software now transmitted a crystal-clear live stream of his microphone directly to my servers. I did not need to be in the room to watch his empire collapse. I could listen to the destruction in real time. The audio feed hummed with the ambient noise of an upscale cafe on Michigan Avenue. I heard the rhythmic hiss of a commercial espresso machine and the low murmur of affluent patrons discussing stock futures. Julian stepped up to the counter. His voice was smooth and dripping with his signature charm as he ordered a double-shot macchiato. The barista greeted him by name. Julian handed over his sleek metal platinum card. I heard the distinct sound of the card sliding into the chip reader. A harsh electronic beep echoed through my headphones. Declined. Julian chuckled. It was a practiced, effortless sound designed to put the cashier at ease. He blamed a faulty security chip or a smudge on the metal. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out his secondary corporate executive card. He handed it over with a confident apology. The barista swiped the magnetic strip. Another sharp beep pierced the audio feed. Declined. The tone of the barista shifted. The deferential customer service voice faded, replaced by a flat, impatient cadence. Julian lost his smooth rhythm. His breathing hitched slightly. The humiliation of a public financial rejection was a poison he had never tasted. He scraped a crumpled $20 bill from his silver money clip and practically ran out the glass doors. The microphone picked up the heavy thud of his car door slamming shut a moment later. His breathing was no longer relaxed. It was shallow and rapid, echoing in the enclosed cabin of his luxury sedan. I tracked his global positioning coordinates on my secondary monitor. He was parked illegally on a side street. He connected his phone to the Bluetooth interface. I listened as he dialed our private wealth manager at the downtown banking tier. The line rang twice before diverting to an automated voicemail system. Julian cursed under his breath. The sound was sharp and laced with genuine panic. He disconnected and dialed the private cell phone number of his lead broker. The call went straight to voicemail. The financial institution had executed its protocols flawlessly. Federal compliance holds dictate the immediate severance of all contact with clients under active investigation. To the banking world, Julian was already a ghost. Panic is a fascinating emotion to observe when you hold the detonator. Julian did not suspect my involvement. He assumed this was a catastrophic bureaucratic error or an overzealous internal audit at his firm. His mind sought the nearest exit strategy. He needed liquid capital, and he needed a secure place to regroup. He shifted his vehicle into drive and sped north toward the Gold Coast. He was heading straight for Victoria. He believed her luxury penthouse was a safe harbor. He believed the offshore shell company registered in her name still held the $4 million he had siphoned from his own children. He thought he could simply log into the offshore portal, transfer a few $100,000 to a clean offshore debit card, and weather the storm in a 5-star hotel. The weather outside my study window was deteriorating rapidly, matching the collapse of his reality. A brutal Chicago winter storm was sweeping off the lake, driving frozen white sheets of snow through the downtown grid. The digital tracker showed Julian pulling into the underground parking garage of her high-rise building. He rode the private elevator up to the 32nd floor. The audio feed picked up the sound of his leather shoes pacing down the carpeted hallway. He swiped his electronic key fob against the security reader on her front door. A dull red error tone buzzed loudly. She had revoked his access credentials. Julian knocked. He waited 10 seconds and knocked harder. His knuckles rapped a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm against the heavy oak wood. He called her name, leaning close to the doorframe. His voice lost its polished timbre, fracturing under the weight of sheer desperation. He begged her to let him in. The deadbolt clicked open. The heavy security chain remained firmly engaged. The door cracked open exactly 2 inches. Victoria did not greet him with a warm embrace or a sympathetic smile. Her voice filtered through the narrow gap, trembling with a potent mixture of unadulterated terror and venomous rage. She asked him what he had done to her. Julian tried to deploy his charm one last time. He pressed his hand against the door, urging her to unlatch the chain. He promised her it was just a minor banking glitch and swore he would fix everything the moment he got inside. Victoria laughed. It was a sharp, hysterical sound that echoed off the marble walls of the empty hallway. The romantic illusion was entirely dead. The wealthy, powerful benefactor she thought she was stealing had morphed into a toxic, radioactive liability. She told him to take his hands off her door. She told him that federal agents wearing dark windbreakers had walked into her corporate office exactly 1 hour ago. The notice I had texted her was no longer a digital threat sitting on a screen. It was a physical, breathing reality. The agents had flashed silver badges and handed her a thick stack of subpoenas right in front of her administrative staff. Because her personal name and residential address were listed on the Apex Property Management registration documents, she was the primary target of a multi-million-dollar money laundering investigation. The offshore funds were frozen tight. Julian tried to interrupt her, weaving a new, desperate lie about a misunderstanding with the vendor contracts. She cut him off with a vicious snarl. She told him she was not going to a federal penitentiary for a married man. She screamed that she had already retained a criminal defense attorney. She had called the assistant district attorney from her office bathroom while the agents waited in the lobby. She turned state's evidence. In exchange for full prosecutorial immunity, she handed over every single text message, every forwarded email, and every digital hotel receipt linking him to the stolen trust funds. She served Julian on a silver platter to the Department of Justice to save her own skin. The betrayers were cannibalizing each other, just as I had calculated. Julian begged. The smooth, sociopathic veneer cracked wide open, exposing the pathetic coward underneath. He pleaded with her to let him inside, just to make a few phone calls to his lawyers. He told her he loved her. The desperation in his voice was sickening. Victoria told him he was a fool. She slammed the heavy door shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a definitive, final, metallic thud. The audio feed captured the sound of Julian stumbling backward away from the locked door. His breathing was ragged and erratic. He walked to the elevator and descended to the grand lobby. The concierge, who usually greeted him with a warm, deferential smile, looked away, pretending to organize a stack of mail. Julian pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out onto the freezing pavement. The wind howled through the microphone, whipping against his expensive suit. He stood alone in the driving snow. His credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. His mistress had become his chief prosecutor. His bank had abandoned him. He was locked out of his secret life and stripped of his stolen wealth. He was shivering without a winter coat. The only place left for a desperate man to go was the one place he falsely believed he still controlled, the boardroom. His impending corporate buyout with a rival conglomerate was his final remaining lifeline. If he could force the merger signature through today, he might generate enough liquid capital to hire a high-powered defense team and flee the jurisdiction. He flagged down a passing taxi, offering the skeptical driver his gold cufflinks as collateral for a ride to the financial district. I disconnected the audio feed and removed the headphones. The silence in my study was peaceful and deeply satisfying. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the fabric of my dress. It was time to leave the house. I had a boardroom to visit and an execution to attend. The executive boardroom of Julian's commercial real estate firm occupied the entire top floor of the glass skyscraper. The walls were sheer floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the freezing Chicago skyline. The custom mahogany table stretched 20 feet long, polished to a mirror shine. I sat at the precise head of that table. It was the chair Julian had occupied for a decade. The leather was still cold when I took my seat. To my immediate right sat Evelyn Sterling. She wore a tailored black suit and a silk blouse, projecting an aura of lethal calm. Evelyn was the most feared corporate litigator in the city. She did not negotiate settlements. She orchestrated financial executions. To my left sat the 7 voting members of the board of directors. They were wealthy, powerful individuals who had spent years enriching themselves under Julian's leadership. Today, they sat in silence, refusing to make eye contact with the empty doorway. At the far end of the table sat Marcus Thorne, the chief executive officer of the acquiring conglomerate. He checked his gold pocket watch, entirely unbothered by the domestic drama unfolding. He was a pragmatist who only cared about securing a lucrative acquisition. The heavy frosted glass doors at the end of the room swung open. Julian stepped into the boardroom. He did not look like a wealthy titan of industry. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. His slate gray suit was soaked from the driving snow, his hair plastered against his forehead in wet, jagged strands. He was shivering slightly, the freezing temperature settling deep into his bones. He had bypassed the front desk security using his biometric thumbprint, assuming he still commanded authority in this building. He stopped dead in his tracks. The melted snow dripped from his expensive wool trousers pooling on the imported carpet. His dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the silent board members, the presence of Marcus Thorne, and finally locking onto me. He saw me sitting in his chair. He saw Evelyn Sterling sitting beside me with a thick stack of legal briefs resting under her folded hands. The practiced charm he had relied on his entire life faltered. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his features. "Bella," he said, his voice hoarse and unsteady, "what are you doing here? You need to leave. This is a closed executive session." I did not stand up. I rested my forearms on the cool mahogany surface, intertwining my fingers. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be, Julian," I replied. My tone was conversational and pleasant. "Take a seat. We have a great deal of business to conclude, and Marcus has a flight to catch." Julian stepped forward, his Italian leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the polished floor. He tried to summon his commanding presence, puffing out his chest and glaring at the board members. "Richard," he snapped, directing his ire at the chief financial officer, "call building security. Have my wife escorted to the lobby. We are finalizing the merger paperwork today." Richard did not reach for the phone. The older man stared intently at his legal pad, shifting uncomfortably in his ergonomic chair. No one moved. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. Evelyn Sterling cleared her throat. The sound cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Mr. Smith," she said, keeping her voice measured and precise, "you do not possess the authority to summon security. You do not possess the authority to mandate a vote. In fact, as of 9 o'clock this morning, you do not possess a voice in this room at all." Julian barked a harsh laugh. The sound was hollow and brittle. "I am the founder of this firm," he shot back, gripping the back of an empty leather chair. "I hold the majority shares. I am the chief executive officer." I reached into the leather portfolio resting in front of me. I pulled out the cheap, thin manila folder bearing the tacky logo of Gary Higgins. It was the exact same preliminary separation agreement Julian had eagerly signed in my quiet study just a few hours ago. I slid the document across the long mahogany table. It glided over the polished wood and came to a stop mere inches from his wet fingertips. "Turn to page 7, Julian," I instructed gently. He stared at the folder. A slow, creeping dread began to wash the remaining color from his face. His hands trembled as he opened the cover. He flipped past the standard boilerplate language about separate residences and mutual non-interference. He reached the dense addendums he had ignored. His eyes scanned the precise legal text tracking the irrevocable proxy waiver. The clause was unambiguous. Upon the initiation of an active federal inquiry, Julian relinquished all proxy voting rights, transferring them directly to his spouse. "You triggered the federal inquiry yourself," I explained, watching his chest rise and fall in rapid, erratic breaths. "When you authorized that $50,000 wire transfer this morning, you routed the capital straight into a Treasury Department honeypot. The compliance hold activated 60 seconds later. Your accounts are frozen. Your offshore shell is under investigation. And according to the document you signed in my study, your voting rights now belong to me." Julian dropped the paper. It fluttered onto the table. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and desperate. He looked at the board members, expecting them to rebel against this hostile maneuver. "This is extortion," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "This is a breach of fiduciary duty. You cannot let her do this, Richard. We built this firm together." "I did not leave this operation to chance, Julian," I said, cutting off his pathetic plea. "You thought I spent the last 3 weeks crying in the master bedroom? I did not. I spent the last 3 weeks auditing every single person sitting at this table. I let my gaze drift over the 7 board members. I looked at Richard, the chief financial officer, who had quietly concealed early losses in a secondary fund. I looked at David, the vice president of operations, who had awarded lucrative construction contracts to his brother's shell company. I looked at Sarah, the compliance director, who had routinely ignored zoning violations in exchange for campaign contributions. "Numbers have no loyalty," I continued, echoing the lesson my father had taught me decades ago. "Only people do, and people are wonderfully predictable when their own secrets are laid bare." I presented the board with a simple choice. They could stand behind a chief executive officer facing a federal indictment for embezzling $4 million, or they could stand behind a senior forensic auditor who promised to keep their individual indiscretions buried in exchange for their unwavering loyalty. Julian stared at the people he had called his friends and allies. They looked away. The betrayal was unanimous and entirely pragmatic. They were choosing their own survival over his sinking ship. Evelyn Sterling leaned forward, opening a pristine black binder. "Let the record reflect that a quorum is present," she stated, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "A motion has been filed to remove Julian Smith from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. The motion also proposes the immediate liquidation of his remaining corporate shares to satisfy a verified multi-million-dollar debt owed to the Family Educational Trust Funds. All those in favor?" 7 hands went up into the air. The movement was synchronized and utterly devoid of hesitation. "The motion passes," Evelyn declared, snapping the binder shut. "Mr. Smith, your tenure at this firm is concluded. Your equity has been seized to repay the stolen capital. You leave this room with exactly what you brought into your marriage: nothing." Julian gripped the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles turned white. His jaw trembled as he tried to formulate a response. There was no charm left. There were no clever lies left to spin. He was a predator who had finally been cornered and stripped of his fangs. He looked at me, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and profound disbelief. "You planned all of this," he whispered, "every single detail." I smiled. It was a cold, detached expression. "I am an auditor, Julian. I balance the ledger. You created a deficit. I simply corrected the math." Marcus Thorne, the conglomerate executive, cleared his throat. He smoothed his expensive silk tie and slid a thick stack of acquisition documents across the table toward me. He did not spare Julian a single glance. "If the internal restructuring is resolved," he said, his tone entirely transactional, "I believe we have a merger to finalize." I picked up my gold fountain pen. The metal felt heavy and cool against my skin. I uncapped the nib and pressed it to the signature line on the final page of the contract. With a few swift strokes, I secured the lucrative acquisition. The company was sold. The capital was safe. Julian stood frozen, unable to process the sheer speed of his destruction. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. The frosted glass doors at the back of the boardroom slid open. 2 burly security guards dressed in crisp, dark suits stepped into the room. They walked with quiet, authoritative purpose, flanking Julian on either side. One of the men placed a firm, heavy hand on Julian's wet wool shoulder. "It is time to leave the premises, sir," the guard stated. His voice left no room for negotiation. Julian looked at the guard and then looked back at me. He was waiting for a reprieve. He was waiting for the emotional, forgiving wife he thought he had married to stop in and stop the bleeding. I offered him nothing. I did not blink. I did not look away. I watched as the guards turned him around and marched him toward the exit. The squeak of his wet shoes faded down the carpeted hallway. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind him, locking him out of the empire he had built and the wealth he had tried to steal. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind the security team. I remained seated at the head of the mahogany table for a long moment. The silence in the executive boardroom felt different now. It was the distinct quiet of a surgical extraction. Evelyn Sterling neatly stacked her legal briefs and slid them into her leather briefcase. Marcus Thorne snapped his gold pocket watch shut, signaling the end of the acquisition meeting. The empire was secure. I stood up, smoothing the silk fabric of my skirt. The operation was not finished. There was one final loose thread I needed to pull. I walked out of the boardroom and into the expansive executive corridor. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. Ahead of me, Julian stood waiting for the private elevator. The 2 security guards flanked him, their postures rigid and uncompromising. The administrative staff peered out from behind their frosted glass cubicles. They watched in stunned silence as the man who had ruled this skyscraper for a decade was reduced to a shivering trespasser. I approached the elevator bank. The digital numbers above the brushed steel doors descended slowly. I looked at Julian. His posture was defeated. His wetsuit hung off his frame like a heavy shroud. As he reached up to wipe the melted snow from his forehead, the cuff of his jacket shifted. A familiar glint of silver caught the fluorescent overhead lights. It was my father's antique Rolex Daytona. Julian had not been wearing it this morning. He had worn a sleek, modern chronograph to hide his theft. The narrative pieced itself together in my mind with clinical precision. When Julian fled to Victoria's penthouse to seek shelter, she had already been visited by federal agents. Terrified of the impending indictment, she must have purged her apartment of any traceable gifts he had given her. She threw the priceless family heirloom at his chest before deadbolting her door. Julian had fastened it to his own wrist, standing in the freezing snow, because it was the only object of genuine value he possessed after his credit cards declined. I stepped past the security guards, placing myself directly in front of him. Julian looked down at me, his dark eyes hollow and bloodshot. The arrogant, sociopathic charm was extinguished. He was a hollow shell of the man I had married. "Take off the watch, Julian," I commanded. My voice did not echo in the hallway. It was a soft, razor-sharp whisper. He blinked, staring at me in confusion. He instinctively curled his fingers inward, pulling his wrist closer to his chest. "Bella, please," he rasped, his voice cracking under the strain. "I have no money. I have no access to my accounts. I do not even have a winter coat. Let me keep this just until I can hire a defense attorney." I did not offer him a shred of sympathy. I reached forward. My fingers brushed against his cold, damp skin. I located the intricate silver clasp of the Rolex. "You traded your family for a cheap illusion," I said, staring directly into his eyes. "You do not get to fund your criminal defense with my father's legacy." I snapped the clasp open. The heavy silver timepiece slid off his wrist and dropped into my waiting palm. The metal retained a faint trace of his body heat. I closed my fingers around the watch, claiming it back. It felt heavy and substantial. It was a tangible piece of honor reclaimed from the wreckage of his greed. The brushed steel doors of the elevator slid open with a soft chime. "What am I supposed to do now?" he whispered, looking into the empty elevator cab, as if it were a tomb. "That is the beauty of this separation, Julian," I replied, taking a step back. "Your survival is no longer my liability." The security guards placed their hands on his shoulders and guided him forward. Julian did not fight them. He stepped into the elevator. He turned around to face me one last time as the steel doors began to close. The narrow gap shrank until it swallowed his face entirely. The locking mechanism clicked. The elevator descended, taking him out of my life forever. I turned away from the descending numbers and walked back toward the executive lobby. Evelyn Sterling was waiting for me near the reception desk, holding her black leather briefcase. She offered a rare, thin smile of professional respect. "The transition paperwork is filed with the State Regulatory Board," Evelyn informed me as we walked toward the exit. "The corporate shares have been successfully liquidated and transferred back into the educational trusts. The deficit is balanced. However, we still need to address his personal vanity assets. The estate garage currently holds 3 vintage sports cars registered under his name. Julian prized his car collection above almost anything else. He spent his weekends polishing the imported Italian leather and bragging about the horsepower to his affluent friends. They were monuments to his fragile ego. "I do not want them," I told Evelyn, keeping my gaze fixed on the revolving glass doors ahead. "I do not want to look at them. I do not want to drive them. I want you to draft the liquidation orders this afternoon. Sell the entire collection to the highest bidder." Evelyn nodded, pulling a sleek pen from her pocket to make a note. "Where shall I route the proceeds from the auction?" she asked. "There is a domestic foundation operating on the south side of the city," I explained. "They provide emergency legal clinics and housing grants for women who are recovering from financial abuse, women whose husbands drained their bank accounts and ruined their credit. Route every single cent from the car auction directly to their endowment fund. Make the donation anonymous." It was the ultimate poetic justice. The vehicles Julian had purchased with stolen wealth would be sold to forge armor for women who had survived men just like him. The cycle of his abuse was broken and repurposed into a shield. We stepped into the grand lobby of the skyscraper. The news of the corporate takeover was already filtering through the financial district. I checked my encrypted tablet one final time. A news alert flashed across the screen regarding a prominent downtown consulting agency. Aunt Valerie's firm was imploding. Federal agents had arrived at her Wacker Drive office executing search warrants tied to the offshore shell company. Valerie had signed the indemnification waiver blind, with arrogance. Now she was facing the full wrath of the Justice Department. The rotten branches of the family tree had been pruned with surgical efficiency. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped out onto the Chicago pavement. The brutal winter storm had broken during the boardroom execution. The dark gray clouds had fractured, revealing a brilliant, piercing blue sky. The afternoon sun reflected off the snow-covered concrete, casting a blinding, pristine light across the city. The air was crisp and biting. It filled my lungs with a sharp, clean energy. I slipped my right hand into the deep pocket of my wool coat. My fingers curled around the cold silver links of my father's antique Rolex. The legacy was secure. The trust funds were restored. The betrayers were locked in a prison of their own making. I walked down the avenue, blending into the busy flow of pedestrians. Nobody looked at me twice. I was just a woman in a tailored coat walking through the financial district. They did not know I had just executed a flawless, multi-million-dollar revenge without ever raising my voice or shedding a genuine tear. If you take away anything from this story, let it be this simple truth. True power is not found in screaming matches. It is not found in breaking dishes or posting tearful paragraphs on the internet. True power is silent. It is calculating. It is the ability to sit quietly in the dark while your enemy builds his own trap. True power is holding the pen when the final ledger is balanced. Thank you for listening to this journey. If you know what it feels like to reclaim your life from someone who tried to destroy it, leave a comment below. Share your resilience. Make sure you subscribe to Sophia Told Stories so you never miss another moment of truth. Stay strong and never let anyone else balance your books. When the dust settles on a shattered marriage, the debris is rarely confined to the two people who signed the marriage certificate. As the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom closed behind Julian, severing him from his corporate empire and his stolen millions, the silence that followed was not just the sound of a woman reclaiming her dignity. It was the sound of a mother securing her children's future. The story of Bella and Julian is, on its surface, a masterclass in forensic retribution and financial justice. But peel back the layers of offshore shell companies, federal tripwires, and frozen assets, and you find a much deeper, more profound narrative. It is a cautionary tale about the sacred contract of parenthood, the heavy mantle of family responsibility, and the terrifying consequences of abandoning the moral compass required to guide the next generation. In the landscape of modern American culture, the traditional family structure is often idealized as a sanctuary, a safe harbor where values are instilled and futures are carefully cultivated. Parents are the architects of that sanctuary. We tell ourselves that providing for our children means setting up the right educational trusts, securing a home in a quiet neighborhood, and passing down family heirlooms like an antique silver Rolex. Julian understood the aesthetics of this responsibility perfectly. He wore the bespoke suits, hosted the lavish dinner parties, and played the role of the affluent, devoted patriarch with terrifying ease. But true family responsibility is not an aesthetic. It is a daily, relentless commitment to honesty. When Julian systematically siphoned $4 million from his twin daughters' educational trust funds, he did not just commit wire fraud. He committed the ultimate parental betrayal. He cannibalized the foundation of his own children's future to feed his immediate, selfish desires. He taught them, through his hidden actions, that their security was expendable. Parenting requires a bedrock of absolute fairness. It demands that we put the long-term well-being of our children above our own fleeting impulses. Julian's willingness to drain their accounts to fund a secret life with a junior executive wasn't merely a financial crime. It was a profound moral failure that shattered the fundamental trust inherent in the parent-child bond. Conversely, Bella's response to this catastrophic betrayal offers a profound lesson in emotional awareness and maternal protection. In our culture, we often confuse emotional awareness with emotional reactivity. We are conditioned to believe that a mother discovering such a massive betrayal must inevitably break down, scream, or surrender to the chaos of heartbreak. But Bella recognized that giving in to chaotic emotions would be a dereliction of her duty as a mother. Her children did not need a weeping victim. They needed a shield. By burying her initial shock beneath a layer of impenetrable, calculating ice, Bella demonstrated the highest form of emotional intelligence. She compartmentalized her personal grief to prioritize her children's survival. This is a vital lesson in long-term guidance for children, teaching them that true strength often lies in the ability to master one's emotions, rather than being mastered by them. Bella's methodical, surgical dismantling of Julian's life was an act of fierce, unwavering love for her daughters. She refused to let them become collateral damage in their father's reckless game. She showed them that boundaries are absolute, that actions have unavoidable consequences, and that a woman's worth is never determined by the betrayals inflicted upon her. The narrative also casts a harsh light on the role of the extended family in raising children within a traditional structure. It is often said that it takes a village to raise a child. In American culture, aunts, uncles, and grandparents are expected to form a secondary ring of protection and moral guidance around the nuclear family. But what happens when the village itself is corrupt? Aunt Valerie, a highly respected corporate strategist, was a woman Bella trusted implicitly. Yet Valerie chose to be the architect of Julian's offshore tax shelter. She advised him on how to bypass security protocols, actively facilitating the theft of her own great-niece's future. This aspect of the story highlights a crucial parenting value. We must be acutely aware of the influences we allow into our children's lives, even when those influences share our bloodline. Fairness and integrity must be modeled, not just by parents, but by the community that surrounds the children. When Valerie prioritized Julian's deceit over the well-being of the next generation, she corrupted the very concept of family loyalty. Bella's decision to legally bind Valerie to the sinking ship was not just about revenge. It was about holding the extended family accountable for their failure to protect the innocent. We live in a society that frequently rewards the performance of success over the reality of character. For a man like Julian, the illusion of the perfect traditional family was a currency he spent freely. He believed that as long as the private school tuitions were paid and the family photos looked pristine, his private sins were irrelevant. But children are perceptive. They do not just inherit our wealth, they inherit our shadows. Had Julian succeeded, his daughters would have eventually inherited a hollow empire built on lies. By stopping him, Bella chose the painful, blinding light of truth over the comfortable, dark illusion of a happy marriage. Ultimately, the climax of Bella's journey is the quiet, deliberate moment in the hallway when she unclasps her father's antique Rolex from Julian's wrist. That watch was more than a piece of silver and glass. It was the physical embodiment of family legacy. Reclaiming it was an act of profound spiritual restoration. We are inevitably passing down a ledger to our children, but the most important entries in that ledger are not financial. They are the values we instill, the respect we demand, and the truth we uphold. Bella secured the trust funds, but more importantly, she secured a legacy of unyielding integrity. Stories like Bella's remind us that protecting our peace and our family's future sometimes requires us to be ruthlessly uncompromising. If you found yourself nodding along with Bella's silent strength, or if you have ever had to stand as the ultimate shield for the people you love, we want you here with us. Subscribe to Salt Vengeance, where we explore the powerful, unapologetic stories of those who refuse to be victims of someone else's greed. Join our community and never miss a journey of reclaimed justice. As the winter sun casts long shadows over the Chicago skyline, we are left to ponder the silent ledgers of our own lives. We all build empires, whether they consist of glass skyscrapers or quiet homes at the end of a cul-de-sac. When the final accounts are tallied and the noise of our daily struggles fades into the background, the money will eventually be spent and the antique watches will be passed to hands we will never meet. All that will truly remain is the invisible architecture of the character we built. The question isn't whether you are leaving a legacy behind for the ones you love. The question is, when they finally open the vault of the life you lived, will they find a foundation of truth they can stand on, or an empty room echoing with the cost of your secrets?